This is the second of two talks on trades that are now long gone in Uttoxeter, but it's these sorts of trades that helped form the town as it is today. Even though they're not there, the people that were involved in doing them and the industries and the trades and industries themselves had a massive effect on the town. So what I'm going to do is a little bit of context to begin with, just in case there are people with us that weren't on the last talk, just to give you a sense of why these things were so important in Uttoxeter. First of all, we've got to remember that this is not the Uttoxeter of 2022. We have to remember that Uttoxeter, certainly from around about 1600, was very, very, very important. It was one of the most important market centres in the country, and attracted people from a radius of about 50 miles to come and exchange their produce. So that very small town that existed in 1600 was in fact, of about 3,000 people, was in fact very big for the time. Certainly bigger than Stafford, and not much smaller than the other big town in Staffordshire at that time, which was Newcastle. So this is the context. It's not a quiet little place in 1600 and even before. It's a place to do significant business, and through that business to become very prosperous, as some of these people did. So it's backed up really by, there's not been that much research on Uttoxeter, academic research anyway, but the research that Angus McKinnon did at Keele in 1987, what he did is to look into the parish records of St Mary's, and very usefully, for a period of about 50 years, the vicar not only recorded the baptisms and the deaths and the marriages, but and the basic details, but he also recorded the occupations of the witnesses. So it actually meant that Angus, when he did his research, can analyse the numbers of people in the town and also what they did. And his conclusion was that it was certainly a leader, not only amongst the towns of Staffordshire, but it was a place of national importance. And if you think of, Uttoxeter in 2022, that might not be the description that you give it. But at this time, it was extremely important. And as I say, a place to do business. So because of that, it meant that in 1690, of people, huge numbers of tradesmen that had set up in Uttoxeter. 72 different types of trades. There's just an engraving, really, a general engraving of the sorts of people that you'd get in any town, in a big town in 1600, and all these were certainly in Uttoxeter. Tonight, though, what I'm going to do is talk about one quite obvious trade and one not very obvious trade you wouldn't have ever associated with Uttoxeter. One was cork and one was cheese. And we have to go back in time, and also therefore a time when these two items and the tradespeople that were involved in them were extremely important to the town. So let's have a start off by the one that we really wouldn't associate, we wouldn't even dream of associating with Uttoxeter, which is cork. The background to a lot of this and a lot of the research on this, I'm very grateful to Joy Dunnicliffe. Joy did huge amounts of research in the 1980s around the trades of Uttoxeter, and particularly around cork. So it's due to Joy's work that a lot of what I'm talking about tonight has come to fruition. So cork, and here's a typical cork maker's shop. There's the two gentlemen cutting cork and the sacks on the shelves are the corks that have been cut and are ready for dispatch. When we think of cork today, we think of cork in probably just in wine bottles or perhaps a few other containers. But you've got to remember that it's a relatively recent invention, that we have screw tops and we have plastic tops and we have ways of sealing containers. If you go back 500 years, then cork was a major substance that was used to seal containers. And it's because of that that the cork industry grew up in Uttoxeter. We tend to think in those sorts of products when we think of cork. Normally, as we can see on the left-hand side there, a bottle cork. But cork makers in Uttoxeter were making cork stoppers that were of a variety of sizes. Some of them that would therefore go over quite significant jars to provide an airtight seal onto a pot and later onto a bottle as glass became more important. So it's a trade that was needed to seal the containers of foodstuffs and other things that were being produced actually in the town. It was also used for a variety of other things. There are corks on this shop, but you can also see there are things like gaskets and washers. Uttoxeter cork, for example, often form the back plates and the polishing plates for glass. We've got some evidence that suggests that some of the cork makers and the cork cutters in Uttoxeter supplied cork to Tutbury glass, so that they could use it as either a backing plate or a shining substance on their wheels as they are beginning to shine their glass. Cork cutter, therefore, and the Uttoxeter cork cutters would be able to make cork stoppers and seals of a variety of shapes and sizes. All of it was hand cut, and there you see an etching of a cork cutter's table, and the top left-hand corner is the traditional sort of stoppers, bottle stoppers. On the right-hand side, these are much smaller. So and the cork cutters would make cork stoppers, seals to order. So they would make a range of a standard size, a standard set of sizes, but they would also make stoppers to order, depending on what product needed to be sealed in what sort of container. So they would cut, and here you can see a modern photograph of standard cork sizes being cut out of bark. And I'll say something about cork bark in the next couple of slides. They would cut out from that bark whatever was needed in terms of the sizes. One big demand for cork from the 1500s onwards, certainly till the late 1800s, was in the apothecary. The equivalent, the original foundation for our chemists. And here you can see this satirical shot picture really of the apothecary filling his medicine bottles, all of which would have been corked. And the stoppers over on the back of him, some of those would have had glass stoppers, but most of them would have had cork tops. So in a time when doctors were very rare, the apothecary was the person you went to if you were poorly, and he would make up a variety of substances, hopefully to make you better, or most of which were kept in bottles that were then stopped with cork. The other thing, of course, that cork was used for is to cork and stop a beer. You can see that there were significant numbers of ale houses in Uttoxeter in the 1600s. Many of them were houses that served beer straight from the jug, but some of them also served ale in containers that then were stopped with cork. And with so much ale being drunk, the demand therefore for cork was very significant. Interestingly enough, one of the first cork makers in Uttoxeter, who didn't do very well actually, was a chap called Marston, Edward Marston. And those of you that know anything about beer will know of Marston's Brewery. And Edward Marston's son, seeing the lack of success of his dad, decided that he would set up business in Burton-on-Trent, and found that actually it would be more profitable to make beer. And that's the origin of Marston's Brewery. But beer and the sealing of containers with beer was very, very, very important to the cork maker, particularly when you've got very large breweries. This is Bunting's Brewery, which was Uttoxeter's main brewery. It's the area now that we now know as the Maltings. So essentially, where my cursor is and the horse is coming out of the gateway there, that would be what we now understand as the opening of the Maltings semi-derelict shops. And all this was on the car park. So essentially, when the beer wasn't being pulled straight from the barrel, then it would be put often in pottery jars, and they would look like this. This is ones that we have in the museum of varying sizes, and you will see that the top of these jars here, the holes, would be sealed with cork. And there is one on the right hand photo which has still got its cork in. And with such a big brewery therefore in Uttoxeter, which actually went back to the early 1800s, and when it wasn't called Buntings, then there was a big demand for the production of cork to go into those beer containers. More bizarrely, and this satirical etching is quite incredible to look at. Yes, there is a man standing on the back of a lady there, putting a very large hat on her head. The 18th century saw a fashion for what we would now know as ladies' bustles, these large expanses at the back of a lady's dress. Originally, the bustle was called a rump, and the rump was made of cork. Because it was light and flexible, then essentially in the 18th century, well-to-do ladies who wanted to have this dress style had the bustle that was then lined with layers of cork, and made this incredible extra expanse to their rear that became very fashionable. It faded out in the 1800s, but nevertheless, with it being extremely fashionable in the mid to late 18th century, 1750s onwards, then it meant there was big trade in the demand for cork, and Uttoxeter was very much part of that. So let's have a little look. So why does cork establish itself in Uttoxeter? Well, we can see why it was there, what products it was produced. But essentially, cork comes from cork trees. And here's a modern shot of chaps that are stripping the cork bark off cork trees. This is in Portugal. So that bark today forms the basis of natural cork products. And in Uttoxeter, from the 15, 16, 17, 1800s, it also formed the basis of the cork industry. The question is, how does that stuff get from Portugal and Spain, which it came from, to Uttoxeter, particularly in the time that is 400 years ago? Which is an intriguing thing. Bear in mind where Uttoxeter is It's the furthest place, one of the furthest places in the country from the sea. So how does it get to Uttoxeter, and then who was involved with it? So essentially, some of you will have, I'm sure, seen cork in its raw state. When it comes off the tree, it's baled up into bales like this. So this is cork, rolled cork bark. It's light, as we would expect, even in bulk, but it is very bulky. It's very sizable. So somehow, some way, this cork found its way to Uttoxeter. And there's still a debate as to how it got to us. But some current research that's being done makes several suggestions. When Joy did her book in the 1980s, and she was in touch with, I think, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, their suggestion was that perhaps a lot of the cork actually came into the country to London, and then it was transshipped up the North Sea, would you believe, all the way to Hull, and then came down the River Trent. Now, incredible journey if you think about it, and what a lot of happened to a lot of products, was not only like cork, was it then was transshipped. So it came up the North Sea to Hull by large ships, and then it was then transferred into smaller boats, and down it came the Trent. This is before the canals were built, and when the Trent was navigable. It would, of course, the Trent doesn't come to Uttoxeter. So then what would happen? It would probably be offloaded, probably in Willington or Chardlow up towards Leicestershire, where it then would find its way across land to Uttoxeter. Now, obviously, when the canal system developed, then they were an easier source to get it in from Liverpool or even from Bristol. But it is thought that a lot of the original cork raw material in the early industry actually came via Hull, and then was transshipped into smaller boats in and around Gainsborough. And you'll see this map come up again when we talk about cheese. Obviously, when the Uttoxeter Canal was built, then there was a means by which it could come to Uttoxeter. Some of you will have heard my talk on the Uttoxeter Canal, which I gave 18 months ago or so. The canal, obviously, that connected Frogall, the Colden Canal from Frogall down into Uttoxeter, and stopped as a dead-end canal at the wharf. So obviously the canal became important. It said, as this slide from that original presentation said, it was granted permission to be built in 1797, but in fact took another 20 years for them to do it. So it was in operation for only 40 years, but it would have made sense to take some of the cork through the canal system, but the route from Hull apparently was quite firmly established. So where was it? Where were the cork makers? Well, the cork makers, this is Carter Street, this is Fountain Terrace. So those that know Uttoxeter may be able to locate that, but essentially from the museum, if you come out the museum front door and turn right, this terrace of houses is on the left hand side. It's a terrace that was built in the late 1800s. But before that, it had actually been a cork works owned by a variety of people, but it was definitely a cork works. And one of the early foundations of the industry, beside the Marston that we know that went off to Burton-on-Trent and made a fortune brewing beer, was a chap called John Vernon. And John Vernon and the Vernon family generally, and there are lots of John Vernons, it's the age-old pattern of name your eldest son after their father. So there's lots of John Vernons, but they're all cork cutters and all cork makers. And the original John Vernon started on that site. We would know him best, though, for his cork works that was off Balance Street in Uttoxeter. Again, those that know the town, if you walk from the health centre away from town along Balance Street, you'll come on the left-hand side just after the Catholic Church of this building. And some of you will know that on it, there is a plaque and it says Vernon House. This is the house, and at the back of it were the works, the main new works of John Vernon, who was a very influential cork cutter and a very important person within the town. He was born in the 1870s, and his sons, who then inherited the business, remained important and tradesmen in the town, and were very influential. So in the 1861 census, you can see that he's employing 12 men, 3 women and 4 boys in cork cutting. So it's not a little tiny room where only one person is cutting cork. This is quite a significant industry. And it made John Vernon a very wealthy man. At this time, even at this time, then Uttoxeter was still a bustling market town, not only attracting lots of tradesmen to set up, but of course on market days there was a huge volume of people coming in to buy things, many of which were in containers, if they were perishable, that had cork stoppers, and John Vernon supplied most of them. So it was very, very good business. It also meant that the Vernons then became very influential in the town. They're interesting in that, like many tradesmen, they shied away from St Mary's, the parish church, the established church, and decided that, you know, for them, they wanted something different. The Vernons put their money behind their faith and were the first ones, therefore, to set up a non-conformist church in Uttoxeter. The original non-conformist chapel meeting room was actually at the back of where Wetherspoons now is in the marketplace. But what the Vernons did is suggest that actually the congregational church, the new congregational church of Uttoxeter, needed a much more established and permanent building. So they put huge amounts of money into it and had this built. This is what was then the congregational church, is now Uttoxeter URC, which is on Carter Street. A lot of the wealth for that building came from the Vernons' cork cutting business, and they were prominent people within that church. When I visited recently and talked to John, who runs the church, he also said that at the back of the church he'd found a little passageway. You can see it round on the left hand side. There's a passageway, and the passageway goes all the way at the back of the church and leads actually to Balance Street. So Mr. Vernon could come to church in his own private passageway into URC. So they were very, very influential in the way that early non-conformist religion was being shaped in the town. Last cork cutter died in 1928. So, oh yeah, it's nearly 100 years ago, but he's actually in the 20th century. And he was a chap called Thomas Harper. His shop, his cork cutting shop, was about where the arrow is. So this is Church Street. And so the marketplace is at where my cursor is at the moment, and you're coming, I'm standing, taking that shot almost at the St Mary's. I am standing directly outside St Mary's Church, and I'm looking down Church Street towards the High Street. And the entrance to what is now the car park was Thomas Harper's cork cutting shop. Joy, in putting a book together in the 1980s, managed to interview Jessie Harper, his daughter, who then told the tale of her dad's cork shop. and how in preparing the cork would arrive in Uttoxeter, and to prepare it so that it was more malleable and easy to cut and make into varying shapes. Mr. Harper had a sort of bonfire, a barbecue arrangement where the cork was actually put on a barbecue. So it singed and burnt slightly, and then was doused with water and then cleaned off. And it's thanks to Joy that actually those thoughts have been recorded. But he was the last cork cutter, often, as you would expect, called Corky Harper. And apparently Jessie tells in her memoirs that in fact, you know, the kids couldn't shake off their nicknames as Corky when they were at school. But let's move on to the second lost trade. This slide came up in my last talk about a range of other trades, and also try to signal why Uttoxeter became so successful. Why was it so important? What was the basis of a lot of the trades? And I suggested last time that really the secret of Uttoxeter's success was cows. Although there were lots of other industries, but you've got to remember that a lot of these industries, including cork and lots of the other things, all relied on products that came from cows. The area around Uttoxeter, again, as I said last time, will grow crops, but it grows on its heavy clay soils, grows grass particularly well. So dairy herds have been kept in and around Uttoxeter for many, many centuries. And it is from those dairy herds, and indeed from the beef herds that I talked about and in my last session, we get the development of the trade and the industry that I'm going to talk about next, which is cheese. Difficult to believe, but cheese from Uttoxeter was renowned. Uttoxeter was thought of as one of the cheese centres of the United Kingdom, even as far back as 1600. And that was due to this quite complex system of tying farms, dairy farms, into the production of cheese, which then came into town. It's quite complex and has been very little researched, but I'll try to give you a sort of simplified version of it. It's so big, the cheese making in Uttoxeter, of which we've got not a lot of record, but there is some out there, and this record is fascinating. This chap, Robert Plot was an Oxford academic who had the idea that he would go up and down the country and essentially write a guide, an encyclopedia, if you like, of each county, to tell people what they did. He didn't get very far. He did Oxfordshire and he did Staffordshire, and that's it. But fortunately, he completed his Staffordshire, and in his Staffordshire guide, he writes this. First of all, he talks about London cheese merchants setting up their factories in Uttoxeter, and that on a market day, they would spend as much as £500 in cheese and butter alone. Now, £500 in 1666 is a huge amount of money. Normally, you would put probably at least 2 noughts on the end, and this is in a week on a market day. It also suggests that the centre was so important that merchants from London established themselves in Uttoxeter. Now, one of the reasons, obviously, that cheese became, and indeed butter became important, is that the vast amount of milk that was being produced in and around Uttoxeter is before refrigeration, before sterilisation, before pasteurisation. It went off very quickly. So a lot of it was processed on the farm into butter and particularly into cheese. And the cheese, therefore, found its way not only into the market in Uttoxeter, but found its way then into the fast growing population of London and the other very big towns of the United Kingdom. And that's one of the reasons why they set themselves up in Uttoxeter. So how did the cheese move around? Well, it was difficult because unlike our Cork example, then cheese is obviously heavy. We're not talking about a small pack from Tesco or Waitrose. We're talking about significant blocks of cheese. Some of it, certainly locally, went in through a complex system of carriers who at first had to endure the terrible roads system that you can see on the left. But when the turnpikes were built, these were like toll roads across the county and across the country. Then there was a complex network, and over on the right-hand side where the star is, that's Uttoxeter there. And all these lines are lines of carriers, a sort of almost a pre-railway network of carriers that took products from Uttoxeter out to other major centres. The width of the line gives an indication of the number of journeys that were made each week. The thicker the line, then the more journeys were made each week. So a lot of it undoubtedly moved locally, certainly within the county, to other centres where it might have then been transshipped. You can see Wolverhampton, particularly down in the bottom left-hand corner, being a particularly prominent town within the Uttoxeter within Staffordshire in the 1830s. But that doesn't explain necessarily how a lot of it actually got into the rapidly developing capital city. And again, we come to our map that we've seen before. And you can see this, I came across this, Daniel Defoe, besides his great literary works, also wrote about his travels. And I came across this information from his travels, which is about the amount of cheese that was again moving along the River Trent. Huge volumes of it, massive tonnage, again, that was coming from Uttoxeter and other areas, obviously, up the River Trent and from Hull, and then from Hull down into the capital city. So it would have been highly likely that those cheese factors that were spending so much money in Uttoxeter would have used that route to market, and therefore used boats similar to the one that you see in the photograph. These are flat bottom boats, river boats, that sailed up and down the Trent, and then to a transshipment point, which was normally Gainsborough. Before then, it was moved into bigger boats as the river got larger, to Hull and away to London. So there was vast amounts of cheese moving up and down the River Trent. And again, it would have gone probably from Willington, possibly from Shardlow. Certainly a PhD thesis that I read recently on the cheese industry suggested on their research that it actually went from Willington onto the Trent and away up north to Gainsborough and then on to Hull. So a lot of it, an awful lot of it, was moving in that direction. So it meant that Uttoxeter, with that sort of business, became an incredibly important cheese centre. This etching, which is not of Uttoxeter, and those of you that got sharp eyes will see that it's from the Aylesbury Dairy Company, but it's a beautiful Victorian advert shows all the processes that are involved in the making of cheese and the retailing of cheese. So essentially, for Uttoxeter, it meant that anything that could be seen on that photograph, any piece of equipment, any activity, anything that was going on in that etching, was being made in the town to support the industry. You will also notice, this is from a trade directory. There are lots of trade directories that were in existence from about the 1800s onwards, and one of the most famous called Piggott's directory. Piggott's directory, and they have a little prelim about what's going on in each of the towns that they cover, suggests that it is Uttoxeter was a town of considerable consequence for cheese, and the cheese factors themselves, and these are the cheese merchants. I'll talk about them in a while, but the principal ones certainly in 1828 were Thomas Earp, James Lassiter, and a partnership between two chaps called Orton and Arnold. What you'll also see is that it was the mentioned Moore dealers, Gent, Stringer, and Vernon. Now this Vernon is our cork maker. As you will see a little later on, then many businessmen tended to have be involved in more than one industry, so that if one failed, they still got the other one to rely on. More dealers. The town became, with its cheese industry, became incredibly important for the supply of more. Apologies if you're eating your tea, because more is cow's stomach, and it supplies the rennet, which then is applied to the milk, which then causes it to curdle in the process of making the cheese. And there were dealers in the town that just did that supplied cow stomachs, particularly calf stomachs. And rennet is still used in cheese making, but it's synthetic and very different now than what it used to be. Even, for example, Henry Bamford, when he set up his ironmonger shop in the marketplace, advertised himself as an ironmonger and a more skin supplier. So everybody had something somewhere to do with cheese. This is interesting, and this included the workhouse. The workhouse, again, those of you that have listened to me talk about caring for the poor in Uttoxeter in the last year will recognise that photograph. We have very few, that's the only photograph I know of the workhouse. There's one more with a carriage outside, but you never get any shots of the inside. The workhouse, which was on the heath. Keele University, most recently, have done quite a lot of research around vouchers. Vouchers were sort of invoices that went from the workhouse to suppliers. A lot of the records for the workhouse are lost, but the vouchers survive. And from these vouchers, you can see a little bit of what was going on. Now, you can see, therefore, that cheese was being supplied at quite significant amounts into the workhouse. And you can see, Mr. Gell receiving £12, 4 shillings and 3 pence in April 1832 for his supply of those 100 weights of cheese. And of course, it was a very important source of protein. And for many people, of course, it meant that the milk that was being produced could actually be made into cheese, and cheese, therefore, kept properly, could last an awful lot longer than the milk ever would. So cheese, therefore, became the product that was preserved, was the milk preserved, if you like. And of course, it was an important part of protein. What they've also found, though, in that research is that this chap, Thomas Hartshorne, supplied the workhouse between those dates, April and June 1830, with 947 quarts of milk. 4 pints make 1 quart. Those that are as old as me will know. there's only 40 occupants, residents at the workhouse. That's a huge amount of milk. The suggestion being that the workhouse was also making cheese, perhaps for itself and perhaps for resale. One of the most important, you notice this idea of a cheese factor, and a cheese factor basically was a cheese wholesaler, like a cheese merchant. One of the wealthiest and most prosperous cheese factor was this chap called Thomas Earp. Now, we've come across Thomas Earp before, because Thomas Earp actually set up the first large brewery in Uttoxeter, which then became Bunting's. Him and his partner, Mr. Saunders, Earp and Saunders, actually set up the brewery that then was taken over by Bunting's. But he was also into being a merchant for cheese as well as spirits. And you can see that what he was doing by this time, because it was open, is probably move his cheese to market through the canal, because this is a map of the wharf and the Uttoxeter Canal. Get those just to give you a bit of orientation. So this is the lower part of the High Street, and this is now Cheadle Road, coming up to the biscuit factory, which is now here. So the wharf, as people will know that have listened to my canal talk, originally had this canal basin just here. So the blue is the canal that goes out of town from the basin. And if you magnify this original canal map around these two buildings here, where the arrow is Mr. Earp's cheese store. So he obviously was moving cheese out from the town via the canal. He was probably moving his beer as well later on, but he was certainly moving cheese along the canal into market. Now, the cheese factor was an important part of the whole industry, the whole trade. So essentially, we're talking about farmhouse cheese. So the cheese was made in farms all around the area, not in vast volumes for any one farm, but nevertheless quite significant. What they then did is to sell the cheese to the cheese factors. They might sold a little bit of it themselves at market, but most of them produced the cheese on the farm and sold it on to the cheese merchants, who were called cheese factors. Now, there's some evidence that it was a sort of almost a tied arrangement, and there's some evidence that suggests that the cheese factors actually paid the farmers not great amounts of money for the cheese, because they sometimes, particularly when the farmers fell on hard times, actually gave them a down payment to tie them in to the fact that their cheese would be supplied to that particular person. So it was quite a strict tying system, and of course those farms that produced the best cheese were highly sought after, because the cheese factor would then take them to market, sell them in bulk to whoever wanted them. They would sell them all through the year, but the particularly important times to sell them were at the Uttoxeter cheese fairs. The cheese fairs were held in March, September, November. This is not Uttoxeter. I haven't ever come across a photograph of the Uttoxeter cheese fair. This is Leicester cheese fair. Similar, very similar. And all these round cylinders are cheeses of varying sizes, varying weights. And essentially it works like any trade really, that they would sell them in bulk. So for example, an area like that over where my cursor is at the moment would be the cheeses being sold by one factor, by one merchant. They'd either sell it as a lot, or they would sell it in a reduced amount, but nevertheless they would sell it on. They would also, because cheese kept reasonably well without refrigeration, would keep for a while. So what the cheese factors tended to do is hold on to it until the market price for cheese was as high as they could get, and so the more profit they could make. They also had it seems a way of knowing whether it's really good cheese, because they're both the factors, the merchants and the people buying it often thought that a good cheese was one that you could use as a stepping stone. So often you see tales of people running across the tops of the cheeses to make sure that they were firm enough and mature enough, therefore, to be worth the purchase. But there were three cheese markets, big cheese markets, that would have looked very similar to this. So if you can imagine the marketplace as is now filled with cheese in a similar arrangement to what you see here, that's what the cheese market would have looked like. What sort of cheese was it? Well, very difficult to know, because there's none left, obviously. It seems, and the trend at the time was to make cheese that was very similar to very mature Lancashire or Cheshire, not like cheddar, a cross between, I suppose, that white cheese that is Cheshire and Lancashire, and I suppose Wensleydale, and also cheddar, sort of cross between them. But obviously the taste seemed to vary from one place, one farm and one factor to another, but generally that's the sort of from the descriptions that you can read, that's the sort of thing that people were looking for. They were particularly what was particularly popular was where something different was introduced into the cheese, and this is where we come to what is, I suppose, the biggest development of the cheese industry, away from small farm production to a much bigger production in Uttoxeter. One thing that the railways did, of course, when they came in the 1840s, meant that you could move the milk much more quickly. This is Lee Station, just down the road from where I'm sitting now, and you can see on the left-hand side churns going that way. Those churns are going up to Stoke-on-Trent, and these churns are going up to Uttoxeter. One thing the railways did for the cheese industry, however, it meant that the farmers, because the production of cheese is quite an arduous, time-consuming process, could actually move their milk much more quickly to places that can use it more quickly in a much more industrialized process. Because the demand for cheese, with the growth in population in the UK as a whole, was enormous and couldn't be satisfied necessarily just by these very small scale farm produced, small volume producers. So the railways actually meant that some farms just gave up making cheese altogether and just moved their milk. It also led to the development of much bigger cheese producing centres. Just behind where the tree is on the right hand side of the photograph, for example, in Lee, had its own dairy just on the right hand side. But in Uttoxeter particularly, it led to the development of two cheese factories. And these are places that are making cheese on an industrial scale. Give you some orientation. There's the railway station, which is still here. You'll notice that this is the line as is now. This is the line, this is the Churnet Valley line that went off through Roaster up to Alton and then on to Leek, and then with a branch off to Ashbourne. So this area where all this area here around Station Road, which is where Tesco now is, and the new Lidl factory, was the cheese factory. So a lot of the milk that would have been turned into cheese on the farm and the cheese being moved into Uttoxeter found its way directly into Uttoxeter, where it was made into cheese in a much larger volumes in the two cheese factories. I spoke just a few minutes ago about what was cheeses that became particularly popular, and at this time was the development of a cheese called Stilton. Now, Stilton itself is actually in Cambridgeshire, and the recipe for the creation of a Stilton cheese with those characteristic blue veins has meant that seemed to exist in and around an inn on the Great North Road. However, there were a lot of that cheese was supplied originally from Leicestershire and was made by a chap called Mr. Nuttall. And Mr. Nuttall, I know a lot more about Mr. Nuttall than I did a year ago, because I've been helping a family with their family research, and who live in Leicestershire, and it just so happened that their great-great-grandfather was a cheesemaker. Mr. Nuttall established himself in those cheese factories. Now, those cheese factories that we saw on the original slide here were originally the brewery, the second big brewery in town. They were Gardener's Brewery. Never that particularly successful, but nevertheless a brewery. They were turned into a cheese factory, however, by a sort of a family coincidence or arrangement, I suppose. The chap that lived in this house here, Ashley, which is still there on the road into the racecourse, is a chap called William Stretch. William Stretch was another Uttoxeter entrepreneur who actually financed the original brewery over this site. The Stretch family became, through marriage, linked into the Nuttalls. And the Nuttalls decided they're from originally from a village close to where I was brought up, called Beeby in Leicestershire, which is near Mount Mowbray. They decided that their original cheesery, their cheese factory producing Stilton, was not big enough to satisfy the huge demand that the late 19th century brought. You can see in their letter heading, which is from the Redfern's archive, the award of 2 first prizes from the London Dairy Show is very important to show how important it was. And this, you can see their letterhead of Melton Mowbray and Uttoxeter. In fact, they abandoned the Melton Mowbray factory and concentrated in Uttoxeter, and through marriage decided that the brewery with Mr. Stretch actually would make a lot more money making cheese. So they turned it into a cheese factory, Nuttall's Cheese Factory. And there, thanks to my friends in Leicestershire, there's Mr. and Mrs. Nuttall. And what's very weird, as we've been digging around the research, is that Mr. Nuttall, on the right-hand side, actually came from a village close to where I grew up, and Mrs. Nuttall, maiden name is actually Marriott, like mine. No relation, unfortunately. That's why the Welsh never came. The wealth never came to me. But there they are, Mr. and Mrs. Nuttall. And they then obviously became a very important link in the dairy farmers in around Uttoxeter. Here's a bill of sale from Nuttall's Dairy. for the 6th of October, 15th of October, sorry, 1896, where a Mr. Buckley is supplying them with 2,116 gallons of milk. And for that, he gets £44, just over £44 for it. Multiply that by about 100, you get an idea of how much it was worth in terms of a supplier. So instead of the factors, the individual factors, the merchants are faded away by the late 1800s, and the dairies, much more industrialized, much more large scale, become so much more important. And there it is. This is a shot. This is the bridge. This is Bridge Street going over the railway. So where the arrow is where the dairies were, where the breweries were, and then became the dairies. Obviously, as an attraction to Mr. Nuttall was the fact that it was next to the railway line. So producing large volumes of cheese and other dairy products meant that he could get it to market pretty quickly. And there's the dairy, again supplied by my friends in Leicester, as it used to look back in the 1800s. What was also interesting, this is a family photograph that was supplied from Leicestershire very recently. What also appears to happen is that Nuttall, when he comes to Uttoxeter, brings his cheesemakers with him. And this is at the back there, where the chimney is the cheese factory, the dairy. And this chap here is the great grandfather of my friend from Leicestershire. This is who'd come over from Beeby, from Leicestershire, to work in Uttoxeter and established his family home actually on Balance Hill. But the idea, what is happening, however, with this industrialisation is this idea of farmhouse cheese production is fading very quickly. So for a number of connected reasons, really. The railways we've mentioned before, large dairies now producing it, and you can see the numbers. 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, there was 3,500 farmhouse cheese producers in the UK, and by 1940 there was only 100 farmhouse cheese producers. These are individual cheese, but small scale, not these almighty dairies. One of the other things that led to the demise, obviously the Second World War led to a huge rationing of products, including cheese. This is a wartime ration board, and this is a fairly, to scale board, and you can see the amount of cheese that was actually on the ration was very small. The other thing is that the government encouraged, whatever you'd like to call it, cheese producers to produce one sort of cheese, which was cheddar. Very much like the sort of cheap sort of cheese that you might see being sold now in supermarkets in bulk, but very processed because it had to last. And it was called government cheddar. What it led to was that all these individual cheese makers producing individual cheese types were then told you can't produce that anymore, and they didn't feel that they wanted to change production. It just wasn't worth it for them, and so that indirectly forced a lot of them to do something else. The other thing on the right hand side is an advert. This is from the newly formed Milk Marketing Board. In the 1930s, when the Milk Marketing Board was formed, it was formed for set of reasons, but one of them was to give dairy farmers a much more standardized price for their milk, and it also meant that they had some control over the sorts of products that were being produced. And in the same way that government cheddar tended to limit the number of cheeses that we produced in the early days, so did the actions and the policies of the Milk Marketing Board. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, is that not only was cheddar, British produced cheddar, on the ration book, but also huge amounts of American cheddar came into the country. And those of you that have spent any time in the States and have tasted cheese will know that it's very different tasting. So it led to really the halting of farmhouse cheese production. The other concern, of course, was that a lot of these farmhouse cheese producers were using unpasteurized milk. And this was also seen to be a contributory factor to the spread of TB in the country. So it was pushing these people that had followed traditional methods for generations into just giving up. And it led, therefore, not only to this massive fall in cheese producers in the UK, but you can imagine that the cheese producers around Uttoxeter, if they still existed, began to fold and end. So you get a move, certainly in the 20th century, from this farmhouse hand-produced cheese that you can see over the left-hand side, to this massive industrialized style of producing cheese, which this is the Dairy Crest Devonstowe cheese dairy producing centre. Very different, very commercialized, very industrialized, mass produced, which dominates much of the food industry anyway, and certainly dominates the mass produced cheese industry. So it led to the decline of cheese in and around farmhouse produced cheese in and around Staffordshire generally, and the country as a whole. And with it, of course, over those hundreds of years of this decline, it then led to the demise of all those industries that had been associated with cheese production. If the cheese is no longer being produced in that sort of way, with all those connected trades, then obviously a whole set of other industries and trades disappears. So, is there any left as we get to 2022? Well, as we know, the dairy in Uttoxeter, under varying names, often the Wiltshire Dairy Company took it over from Nuttall's and ran it successfully for a number of years. Was still in existence, producing dairy products for some considerable time. And this beautiful photograph of people that are now still alive in Uttoxeter is of promotion of that particular centre, but that, as we know, closed in the late 20th century and was demolished, and houses built on one side, and then on the other side you see the development, which is now the retail park, which includes Tesco's and Lidl and all those collection of stores. So is it the end really for farmhouse cheese? Well, as those of you like me that like cheese very much, also know that there is a sprinkling of small scale producers. I think after the Second World War, there were some that felt there might be a market still for farmhouse produced cheese. And if you look hard enough away from the supermarkets, in the specialist cheese shops, and particularly at farmers' fairs, you will still see some farmhouse produced cheese. Not a lot in Staffordshire, but it just so happens that just up the road from where I'm sitting today in the village of Lee is one of those producers. On a daily basis, if I walk past the farm, that's what I see. This is the Guernsey cows that seem to feed all the time in the barn that's just up the road from where I'm sitting today. Because from 1955, one of the Staffordshire dairy farmers in this area in Lee, the family decided that they would return really to the production of farmhouse cheese, and is one of the only ones that are still left. And they produce a cheese called Guernsey. And here it is. It's producing Grange Farm, which is just up the road. I get no cut from the advertising. And it's produced actually on the farm. So it's almost coming back full circle, where, you know, farms are producing their own cheese for sale. And Guernsey, as a farmhouse produced cheese, is not available in the supermarkets, is available from Lee Post Office here in the village, and directly from Ernie Duros. It's the Duros family that produced the cheese in Grange Farm, and you'll see it occasionally at fairs, produce fairs, and occasionally some of the milkmen occasionally stock it, and you can get it directly from Ernie himself. And if you're ever interested, then if you go on to Guernsey and look at his Facebook site, then you can see his contact. But it's fantastic, and he produces a range of cheese, three main ones. This one, which is like a hard cheese. They do a brie, and he's even been experimenting recently with halloumi. But it's come full circle, and I'm pleased to say that unlike some of the other trades that I talked about in the last talk, and in this talk, there is a lost trade that's not quite lost yet,